All right, and we are good to go.
I'm ready for me.
Yep.
Good morning and welcome everybody to the National Institute for Lobbying Ethics webinar this morning. Hope everybody's doing well and safe. I just want to remind everybody, if you can, just to make sure you're on mute so that we don't have any distractions. And also, please feel free to use the chat box and ask any questions that you may have during this webinar. We will ask the questions as they come in, and so if you feel you have a question come up, please feel free to ask it right out of the gate, and we will make sure that we will ask it to the panelists. Hope everybody is doing well. This pandemic has been a real challenge for everybody. It has caused us to try new ways on how we do our jobs, which has made it a little bit more difficult, I think, and we'll hear from our panelists today on what they're doing differently versus what they used to do, whether it be walking the halls or walking into the agencies. I also understand that this pandemic has also hit our profession like it's hit every other business across this country. So we have heard a lot of stories of quite a few people being furloughed. So our industry has taken as big of a hit as any. And so we are here for you. We have a job board. We are willing to work with you in getting resumes out. If anybody has questions or needs some help in that regard, please contact us. We are happy to help during this period of time. And we are also willing to, if you're not a member, have you join right now at no cost so that you can take advantage of these programming opportunities and other services that we offer. So we know it's a difficult time, but we want to help and be a resource to you as much as we can. So saying that, I want to also acknowledge Nicole Smith, who is the behind the scenes brains of this operation, who's doing everything today. Also want to recognize Tommy Goodwin, who I believe is on the call. He is the current president of the Institute. I want to acknowledge Elizabeth Bartz, who I believe is also on. She is a board member of ours, as John Gentile. And if I missed anybody, I apologize. But we have a good group of folks on today, and I want this to be very interactive as we go forward. For those of you not familiar with the Institute, we are the Professional Trade Association for those of you in the lobbying profession. We have been around since 2016, and so our focus is what the name and the title says. We are focused on ethics, and that is a big core piece of what we do. Education is our main focus, and we have a public policy certificate program that is really considered the gold standard within the profession. So I'm going to leave it at that. You can go to our website at lobbyinginstitute.com if you have any questions or questions with regards to what we do and how we do it. I first want to just read a statement that the board of directors put out yesterday with regards to everything that's going on here in this country that we started to see last week. And you can find it on our social media feeds, and you can also find it on our website, but I just thought it was important enough that the board had asked me to read it prior to our program today. The National Institute for Lobbying and Ethics is in support of and aligned with the message that has been laid out for us by the Black community against racism and brutality within our justice system. We stand with the Black community. We grieve for the families that have lost loved ones to violence and injustice. We stand with the individuals fighting against systemic racism within American institutions. We are inspired and encouraged by the peaceful protests and political engagement taking place in cities throughout the country that have asked every individual and organization to look inward, to learn and examine our own institutionalized racism. We have taken this to heart. Niall understands that racism is a complex system of social and political mechanisms set up to discriminate against persons of color. We are listening, learning, and are looking inward at how we can be part of the solution and lead by example. We strive to create educational spaces that allow our profession to learn from each other and educate ourselves. We encourage you to be active in confronting injustices when they occur, to not be a bystander, to support national and local organizations leading the effort to bring change to our communities, and look inward to your own organizations. We are stronger together. So with that, I do want to kick off the program by introducing our speakers who I've had the opportunity to work with for many years and also have known for probably years before that. Our first speaker is Rob Burton. He is a partner in the government contracts group at Crowell & Mooring, a law firm here in Washington, D.C. Rob is nationally recognized as a leader in federal procurement who assists government contractors with complex and rule-driven procurement processes and their ethics and compliance program. He also can assist contractors with their marketing strategies for selling to the federal agencies, provides expert witness testimony in arbitration and federal court cases, and works with senior agency procurement officials to resolve contract issues. He is a 35-year veteran of the procurement law and policy development. Rob served in the executive office of the president as the acting and deputy administrator of the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, the nation's top career federal procurement official. At OFPP, Rob prepared policy positions and worked with House and Senate committees on the development of acquisition-like legislation. He has also served as the principal spokesperson for government-wide acquisition initiatives and chaired the Federal Acquisition Regulatory Council and Chief Acquisition Officers Council. I've known Rob for a long time. He is a straight shooter, one of the good guys in Washington. And I will turn it over to you, Rob, if you want to say a few words about who you are and what your firm does.
Oh, you're so nice. Hey, thank you so much, Paul, and thank you so much for giving me opportunity to be with you this morning. I really appreciate it. Yeah, we've known each other for like 20 years, I think, Paul. Wow. Yeah. You know, I can't believe we're getting older. But I work with Crowell Moring. Crowell Moring in downtown DC is the largest government contracts law firm in the country. We do everything. We do bid protests. We do investigations. We put together ethics and compliance programs for companies. We do Hill work. We do a lot of agency work. And so I'm somewhat the unusual partner in the group, in that I do a lot of meeting and greeting and working with the agencies, because I have so many relationships. Because I was head of federal procurement for the federal government, I have a lot of relationships with the procurement people in companies. So it's a nice fit, since the firm basically does mainly government contracts work. It's a nice fit to be there to do the government relations piece, if you will, with both the Hill and the federal agencies.
Thank you for that. Our next speaker, who I've also known for probably 15 years or so, John Bird, is Vice President with John Pelletiello and Associates. And throughout his 15 years of experience, his accomplishments include enhancement of 2 political action committees, creation of a congressional caucus, assistance in arranging several congressional committee testimony invitations, organization of presentations before federal agencies, public hearings, initiation of a series of Washington policy forum luncheons, providing legislative content, and publishing weekly and monthly newsletters on the execution of government affairs programs. In addition to working closely with key members of Congress to win numerous recorded votes on amendment language to appropriations bill, he has been involved in securing legislative reforms to the 2012 National Flood Insurance Program, the 2018 Farm Bill, and annual defense authorizations bills. And I can say about JB is, if anybody works on the Hill, you've probably seen JB walk in the Hill every day. He's probably the hardest working lobbyist I've ever met and seen. He is a true grassroots guy, and also has a reputation, a strong reputation of building a solid network of relationships up there on the Hill. So with that, JB, I'll turn it over to you. Say a few words if you want.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, for that introduction. And let me say first, I appreciate the opportunity to be invited to participate on this panel with 2 friends and colleagues I've known for over 15 years now, you and Rob Burton. I started with John Pelletiello and Associates 15 years ago, and we have a great team based in Fairfax City, Virginia. I help represent trade associations, professional societies, individual firms, and either run numerous coalitions, or am a proud member of so many other coalitions which help amplify our voice in Congress and effectiveness for our clients. So thank you, Paul.
I appreciate it. All right, we're going to get started here. Again, if you have a question you'd like to have asked of these 2 gentlemen, please type it in the chat box, and we will get that question out and answered for you. Let me start with this for both of you to answer. Maybe JB, you can go first. This pandemic has caused us to really change how we do things. And for me, I know I've had to go through a lot of different changes in how I've conducted my business. So let me start here. Lobbying has changed considerably over the last 5 or 10 years pre-COVID-19. And since this pandemic, we've seen a lot of changes here. Can you both speak to what your days were like pre-COVID-19 and how you advocated for clients both on the Hill and with the agency? So let's start pre-COVID, and then we'll jump into how you're doing business today. So JB, why don't you start?
Sure. Well, as far as how my days start and how they end and what happens in between when it comes to lobbying Congress or agencies, my commute into DC is typically 1 hour and 15 minutes. And I would leave very early or late, always missing peak traffic. Now, what I would do once I get to the Hill, I'd set up my laptop in one of the cafeterias and fire away my emails or make calls from there in between my meetings with staff in their personal or committee offices. Now, foot traffic and retail politicking is a big deal with exposure to members and staff simply by roaming the corridors on Capitol Hill or pigeonholing them in an elevator, whatever the case might be. You just run into a lot of familiar faces and opportunity to retail with them. Now, those made for some long days on Cap Hill. Now, as to federal agencies, these largely were done by calls and emails. And that is outside of fly-ins where our partners in the federal agencies were invited to attend and brief our members, or whenever there's an in-person budget briefing opportunity early in the year, or public comment periods and public events where you can actually go into the agencies and also see them as part of larger public gatherings. Now, occasionally, you could also connect with the federal agency folks with them on Capitol Hill during special occasions when they were part of congressional testimony or hearings, or attending receptions such as technology expos or exhibitions in the actual Senate and House office buildings. So those are kind of typical opportunities to interact with members of Congress, their staff, and agencies beforehand.
How about you, Rob, pre-COVID?
Well, you know, pre-COVID, things have changed actually over the last 10 years, I would say. We've become so electronic. Everything I remember going into a meeting on the Hill with a Hill staffer, and my client had a nice little briefing package with the slides and so forth. They were going to walk through, everything. And the person said, don't even hand that to me. I don't want it. Just send it to me electronically. I don't like paper. And that was probably 10 years ago. And I saw a change back then, sort of moving to formal presentations in person with paper, to a desire to have things electronically. So we were sending things electronically well before COVID, right? So, I mean, the world had already sort of changed to an electronic world, briefings at least, and sending information. But the internet really changed how lobbying was done in Washington. And so now this just takes it to a new level. In my view, the COVID has now taken it to a new level of even more reliance on technology and lack of face-to-face meetings.
Well, let me do a follow-up with both of you on that. JB, based on your comments and how you have done it pre-COVID, would you say that typically with your commute and everything like that, you were more of a virtual, call it virtual operation anyway, with the traveling bag and computer and all the needs that you have, so you could actually operate wherever you were, whether it be a cafeteria, at one of the Democratic or Republican clubs, or somewhere in between?
Yeah, so yes, I had already basically developed an opportunity where I'd streamline my interaction, mostly with staff. But the important thing is that you had visibility on the Hill at the same time that you were trying to do things behind the scenes, email and call wise. So you're kind of trying to do as much double dipping as possible and making as much use of your time efficiently while you're up on the Hill. But yeah, so I started kind of figuring things out as far as how potentially I could adapt now into the COVID and the pandemic. But I'd worked with some of the technology before, but not to the extent as the last few months. But it helped kind of prep me, if you will.
Okay. And Rob, you talked about your experience over the last 10 years. It really started to go more electronic with the presentations and things like that. Is that because staff wanted the presentations ahead of time, or was it more that staff wanted those because they just didn't have time to really go and dive into them now because of their workload that they had going on? They wanted it for a later date, and electronically was probably the easier way to do that, or it was just a laziness thing?
Yeah, they generally would look at it later. Yeah, that's for sure. And sometimes I don't know if they ever looked at it, quite frankly.
Okay.
But and that's why, I'm somewhat of a believer of in-person meetings. I think they're more effective, and we'll get to that, Paul. But I think I don't think this is good. This whole idea of total electronic communication, I think it's actually has a big negative to it. and so that's my concern. I'm very concerned about post-COVID and exactly what's going to happen. And quite frankly, it's much harder to deal with the agencies. I have found it actually easier to deal with the Hill. The federal agencies really don't like to communicate. They don't like to talk, especially the procurement people. I mean, it's tough. It really is tough trying to engage with the procurement people at the agencies. And the Hill people sort of know they have to communicate, that they may not get reelected if they don't exactly talk to people. And they're going to be more inclined, I think, in a post-COVID to have personal meetings. Not so much in the federal agencies. They're not running for election, and they generally don't like to communicate. And I've always found it a challenge to communicate with federal agencies, much more so than the Hill.
And let's move on to the next question. And again, for both of you, and maybe we can start with Rob this time. We'll alternate every other one or something like that. How do you see your role today versus pre-COVID-19? Do your clients expect you to act in a different capacity, or is it business as usual with your clients? What are the client expectations for you today?
Yeah, so again, I deal primarily with government contractors. I deal primarily with the procurement folks at the agencies. And in that regard, there's enormous frustration, and people are somewhat depressed, quite frankly, because the procurements are not on schedule. Everything has been delayed. A lot of people are worried about whether procurements will happen at all in some agencies. Some agencies probably will have to reprogram money. They may not move forward with certain competitions that they were thinking about doing. So client expectations are just basically, I don't know if you'd say they're low expectations, but they're very, very frustrated, and they feel like there's not much they can do about the situation. It's somewhat true. But there have been pockets of great opportunities, right? So with like SBA handing out billions of dollars, there's been enormous pressure from clients to move quickly with respect to trying to get some of that money, some of that loan money, some of the grant money. So again, a lot of frustration in that regard, right? With respect to trying to reach out to agencies. And of course, agencies are just overwhelmed. Those agencies, like the Small Business Administration, overwhelmed. And they can't really deal with having meetings and talking to contractors. So enormous frustration and higher expectations with respect to those opportunities that are very limited and time sensitive at SBA and all the health agencies. And so it's been a lot of pressure with respect to trying to respond quickly. SBA, for example, just came out, I think it was Friday, with a $100 million potential BPA with a week turnaround, 1 week turnaround, just insane. And a lot of contractors were not even aware of the opportunity. So I think that is subsiding some now. We're getting a little bit back to normal in the sense of starting to focus on regular procurements, if you will, if there is such a thing. But I think this just been enormously frustrating for government contractors the last couple of months.
How about you, JB?
Well, let me just break down some just brief stats about literally my commute and what that means now we're telecommuting, and what that provides potentially for client expectations as a result. So in comparison, with very little chance of retail and obviously the social distancing issues, I now have 2.5 hours per day to work minus my commute. That equates to 12.5 hours per week and roughly 50 hours per month. So what are the newer expectations for clients, and how can I get my job done effectively? Well, this provides me considerably extra time to plan and act, and perhaps be more thorough with targeted outreach and the opportunity to communicate not only with Cap Hill contacts and coalition partners, but also with clients. So while in one sense it is business as usual as to providing value and meeting and or exceeding expectations for clients for interaction on the Hill, what has changed is how do you get there? So that's what I'm still trying to adapt to and make sure that those 50 hours each week or month I can actually put into good use.
Can I, just a follow up to both of you, Rob, you do a little bit different work than JB does, but the question's for both. Do you see your clients, you wearing more than your normal hats for your clients during this pandemic? And again, I have a couple questions here that will follow on to that. But I guess from my standpoint, do you guys see yourselves wearing different hats that you might not have had pre-COVID-19 that clients are relying on you for now that they may not have asked you to do in the past because there may not have been a need for it?
Well, Paul, no, I know it's pretty much the same. And what I'm doing is pretty much the same. You know, a lot of what I do also is with respect to the National Defense Authorization Act. A lot of acquisition reform legislation is in the NDAA. Well, most of that work had been done. Like January, February, March is when you really go to have meetings on the Hill when you're trying to influence the NDAA. So most of that had already occurred before the pandemic. And then you go into less meetings. And so we're in the cycle that we're in, we're sort of in the less meeting cycle. So with respect to the work on the Hill and the NDAA, it hasn't really impacted that, except there's lower expectations. There's sort of a feeling that we're not going to get much in the way of acquisition reform legislation this year. So I think there is a reduced client expectation with respect to what can realistically be done with the NDAA. The Hill's just not that focused on it. And hopefully that will change next year. So maybe we'll be back to meetings on the Hill back in the January, February, March timeframe. So in my world, with respect to acquisition reform legislation, it's been somewhat business as usual in that regard.
How about you, JB?
I'm finding communication with clients and over the Hill, but mostly with the clients has exploded skyward in numbers and need. One of our clients receives up to 10 messages a day from me, email-wise, and I'll occasionally use Saturday mornings as another communications opportunity. The trade-off being they wanted it and they requested volume increase. Now, some of these other opportunities to really engage digitally or online with our clients, attending online board meetings, staffing monthly webinars, participating on podcasts, increasing the volume of emails to key points of contact within the clientele, and decreasing the expected turnaround time on special projects. So that means for me, I've got to engage other organizations for mutually beneficial advocacy. We're finding we're signing on to way more coalition letters, including one for, Rob mentioned NDAA, there's the infrastructure, the highway bill. There are just numerous opportunities, and I know we're going to talk about approps pretty soon. But yeah, lobbying congressional staff, using conference call and webinars, connecting with candidates for Congress, using webinars and Zoom sessions. So I'd say to sum up, our clients have been worried, and we are there to help them in these unprecedented times. So as a result, I feel that the relationship has never been better.
Okay. And JB, you just touched on, we've got 3 questions here that I'm going to go to, and you touched a little bit on all of them. So I have you and Rob touch on these in a little more detail. Let me start with the one from Tommy Goodwin. He saw an interesting survey the other day that found more than 2/3 of surveyed government relations executives believe that after COVID-19, it will remain difficult to meet with federal policymakers in person. Do you think that's the case, or do you think there will be a move back to us getting back in their offices and doing that personal one-on-one, or will it be like we saw in 9/11? After a while, it became very difficult. Members shut us out and wouldn't let us in to meet with them. Do you think this is a trend, or is this something that's going to be short-lived?
I think it's just going to come down to the individual lawmaker, what their natural instincts are. If they're really looking to engage folks, they'll find a way to open back up and be as close to normal as possible. But if they prefer more of a sheltered approach where it requires more hurdles to get a hold of them or their staff, it just depends on the office. I think the interesting thing is that I think more folks on the Hill, member-wise, are utilizing the technology, just like when, what's it been about a decade ago, the town hall meetings back in their congressional districts or states were becoming very raucous, as some of them turned to teletown halls. You could see this exact same thing happening now with opportunities to leverage think tanks, advocacy groups, opportunities to host webinars where they bring in and pitch softball questions instead of, harder questions or opposing points of view. So if an office holder or a senator wants to get more verbiage and get the communications out, I think they're going to actually leverage some of the newer opportunities the technology provides them. And as folks adapt to that and groups want to engage, they're going to reach out and provide those members more opportunities to do so. But it's not going to be an open process. And it's going to be pretty much staged, just like theoretically a majority would run a congressional hearing.
How about you, Rob?
Yeah, I'm worried about it, Paul. I mean, as I think I mentioned, agency personnel generally don't like to meet with people, especially in the acquisition offices. And it's always been difficult. I think my concern is they are going to use this as a way to say, let's just do it over the phone. You don't need to come in. From their perspective, this works quite well because generally when I went into agencies, it would be for an hour. We would have an hour meeting, a lot of glad handing time. That's gone. That's gone, and we get down to 30-minute calls. Agencies are scheduling 30-minute calls. And this is what really kills me. I think this is true with the Hill too, JB. Tell me if otherwise, but they're not on camera, right? So you cannot see their facial expressions. You cannot communicate with them as well because there's a lot of nonverbal communication at these meetings, and that's gone. And we may be on camera, but they're not on camera. And I find it really difficult. You get these pregnant pauses and so forth, and you don't know what they're thinking. Are they looking at something else? Are they really listening to you? Or are they reading something for the next meeting they have? I think that's going on, quite frankly. And so I'm not thrilled at all with the idea that the agencies may use this as an excuse. I think we're done for the year. I mean, I think for the rest of this year, it's going to be very difficult to go in to have agency meetings. But I am worried that the agencies are sort of liking this. They're sort of liking the idea of, hey, just a phone call for 30 minutes and we're done. And I think they're going to have a bad habit here, if you will. And I think they're not going to want to change.
Well, and Rob, I tend to agree with you. I'm just going to add on this comment because of the conversations I've had over the last few weeks, like everybody else. I think when you move to remote voting in the House, I think that is that seemed to be a temporary solution. I'd be very, very surprised if that's a temporary solution and that doesn't become permanent if they seem to feel that it works well for them. Again, distancing themselves from the Capitol, distancing themselves from all of us. I look at it. I've talked to a lot of staff who are tired of the phone calls, who would like to get back to the in-person meeting. So I do agree with you, JB. I do think a lot of this may come down to individual offices and preferences going forward. But I've also, from my own perspective, I have found it probably more successful doing these phone calls with staffers because I think I have found that they've been a little bit more relaxed. I've gotten higher level folks, and I quite frankly, I was on a call with, I'm not going to say which office, but it was in leadership, and the woman was doing dishes, and you could tell it while we were on the phone, but she gave me more than I would have gotten sitting across from her. So I think it was a more relaxed environment. And when you have a mom who has to also work for her boss, but also because childcare is not available, has to watch her 2 young kids, you got to adapt. And I think for me, that didn't bother me that she was doing dishes. It was just more of, hey, it was a better interaction for me. But I am concerned about the long-term impact that this may have on sheltering us from the actual members. And I think that's a disservice to them and their constituents, quite frankly.
Interesting.
Let me move into the other question. I got a couple here, but I want to start with this one because JB, you touched on it a little bit. The question is, it comes from Julie, and I don't have her last name here. She has found that Zoom PAC events are ineffective. So how do you address the role of fundraising? I can tell you, I've seen a lot of those fundraising notices about a Zoom lunch or a Zoom happy hour. How do you deal? You do a lot of the events, JB. How do you deal with those now?
To be brutally honest, I have not attended one of the PAC events where you have to pay. What I have done is when the PACs or when the candidates will do a meet and greet digitally. And what I'm finding is that given where we are with the primary season and some of the runoffs, there have been opportunities for current members of Congress to actually join these, and you get the double dip for free. And if you get the right campaign, to get the right fundraiser setting these up for you, then what you can do is you get a current exposure to the current office holder who's basically trying to endorse someone to take over their open seat or what they're vacating or whatever. And then you also get exposure to the candidate. And so I'm trying to maximize the meet and greets. One of the things we try to do for some of our clients that have weekly e-newsletters is shy of actually doing the retail, going in and actually shaking hands and making a quick 30 to 2-minute pitch. What we've started to do is to engage the fundraisers and the consultants and simply say, can we put together a Zoom for 5 or 10 minutes, do a screenshot photo of the candidate and myself. And what we do then is we take that photo of the candidate and myself, and we'll actually put a caption with a link straight to their website on our email newsletter that goes out weekly. So that any of our members for a client that has a national membership or that specific state where there's a state chapter or affiliate, they can see that we've actually reached out to the candidate for an open seat or those kind of opportunities. And then they can see that we've met with them, number one, and then they can go straight to the website and leave it up to them. So it's not our PAC per se endorsing someone, it's our PAC exposing to our members and to our clients who the candidate is. And if they actually like the candidate, this is the quickest way to access their website and then contribute. So we find that the fundraisers are actually really appreciate that opportunity, and so do the candidates.
How about you, Rob? Anything for you?
Well, I don't do a lot of the fundraising piece of this, but I'll tell you, I go to a lot of conferences, right? I go to a lot of conferences with respect to federal procurement. The NCMA, the National Contract Management Association, they have a huge conference every July, 2,000 people. That's been canceled. It's going to be done virtually. There's just no way that's going to be very effective. I think there's just no way. And a lot of sponsors don't want to sponsor because they're thinking, well, geez, there's not going to be that many people, and they're not going to be people that we can touch or feel and see them. And I think that there is a place for group meetings and large networking conferences. The lack of that, I think, is going to have a huge negative impact on the federal procurement process. I mean, it's just the inability for industry and government to communicate in these settings. I think it's just terrible because contractors complain all the time that they have trouble communicating with government people. Government people don't seem to really want to communicate. They have at least some opportunity because a lot of these conferences attract both government and industry people. Without any of that networking, with all that gone, it just makes it incredibly difficult for industry as they try to approach the government.
Well, Julie, I'll just add my own comments on here because what we have done, we don't represent any clients that have big time, what I would call big time PACs, but we do represent some that have PACs. And what we have done started years ago, like everybody else is doing, was the one-on-one in-person meetings with the member at a club or at somewhere else at a different location. We've kind of translated that into this virtual side. We don't do the virtual happy hours or whatever it is. I don't find the value there. So what we have done is we've asked for individual phone calls. And so that's what we have moved to with the members. And I think it's going to matter. It's going to depend on your relationship with the fundraiser. It's going to depend on your relationship with the actual member and their staff. And I think it's going to come down to the dollar amount, whether or not they're going to have the time to do that. But everybody's going to see their fundraising down this year. And so I think they're going to all look for opportunities where they can to kind of maximize that and get those contributions in, because this is, again, every year or every 2 years, every 6 years, whatever it is going to be the most critical election we have. And so I think everybody's looking at this year in November going, hey, where the dollar's going to come so that I can compete from, particularly if you're running for open seats or you're a challenger. So I think they're going to do as much as they can. So you may want to suggest, hey, I don't want to do this virtual thing, but I'm happy to do a 15 to 30 minute phone call with you. And I think a lot of them will take you up on that. The next question again comes from Julie as well. Is two-part question. How do you keep up your relationships with staff and agency folks during this process? If you're only doing phone calls, I know like JB, you typically walk around the hill, you run into people. We all do that. We stop and say hi. We stop by offices when we have a few minutes. Rob, you may do the same thing with the agencies. When you're in a particular agency, you may stop by to see somebody you know there.
Right.
How do you maintain those relationships in today's environment?
I think you just got to be proactive. What we try to do, we have a lot of bipartisan bills in the House and Senate that we work on, pre-pandemic. And so we given how somewhat dysfunctional the House and Senate have become as far as moving bills or having hearings or markups, what it requires then is to just see what kind of outreach we can do to get the staff re-engaged on the issues. When it comes to caucuses, I try just in general to reconnect with anyone who's running a caucus quarterly. Just see what do you have planned? Are there any briefings? And what I also try to do, because you don't have access to all the lawmakers' schedules. So what I try to do, my daily setup is by 7 a.m. I've got about 30 Google Alert media alerts. I've got 10 media bulletin briefings. And then I've got another about 10 or so think tank advocacy group postings that are scheduled for webinars that day or later that week. And you'll run into just the overlap. There's so much going on, just like a typical committee schedule would be from Tuesday and Thursdays, the peak of the typical work week on the Hill. What we're finding is that those webinars, those opportunities to engage people, but by default, then you can reach out to their staff. And that's usually just like the committee structure, 10 o'clock to roughly 3 p.m. from Tuesday through Thursday. What I find myself doing is I get triple booked in some cases for the luncheon webinars. And the good news is this: if you miss any of those, they're typically archived and webcast. So, later in the day, if you have some idle time or on the weekend, you can get caught up on anything that you've missed out on. But what that gets you is access then, knowing about the different offices that you work with. Then you can just re-engage the staffers for those bosses that you know and just say, hey, saw your boss pitching this. By the way, what are you hearing anything differently from the committee about scheduling a markup for our bill? So they're just got to be proactive and utilize the data that's out there that's publicly available to your benefit.
How about you, Rob? How are you keeping track with keeping up the relationships?
Well, I'll tell you, Paul, it's a lot of emails. We really have gone to more email communication now, and I'm usually following up on something specific. So it's not just saying hi. It's usually an issue. It's usually a problem with the contract, or something about an upcoming opportunity with respect to a contract. And so a lot of, but the response varies. The responsiveness of government officials just vary. And this is where relationships are so important. So where I have strong personal relationships, it works a lot better. If it's somebody I don't know very well, and I have not really met them in person, the responsiveness is not good. It's just, and this is why I think there'll always be a need for folks like us, because it takes a while to develop these relationships, and it's something you can't do in a week or two. In a lot of these relationships I have go back decades. And so when you have a strong relationship, the communication seems to be much, much easier. And I have had situations like you were talking about, Paul, with somebody doing the dishes. One of the top procurement official was preparing her dinner and talking to me on the phone. Been unusual. Now, that would not have happened if I had not had a close personal relationship with that person. And so I think a lot of this depends on the strength of the relationship. I'm not finding a lot of success with communicating with people that I don't know.
Hey, Rob, can I just piggyback on something you brought up there? For the folks that we don't have good connections with on the Hill, one thing that I've tried differently is I now tag team with another colleague in another group. And what we do, for instance, the issue being rural broadband deployment and telecom issues, what we've ended up doing is the two of us will actually offer up the same 30-minute slice of time for a new office that we haven't approached or new staffer. What the staffer gets out of that is they get two voices from two different perspectives on the same issue. And instead of doing two different calls with two different logistics, we provide value and efficiency for them. For us, we've done this for probably now on 30 or 40 calls. I've teamed up with this colleague of mine, Larry LeClaire, who represents the surety bond producers. So we've been working this issue from a rural broadband mapping, a surety bond issue connected to rural broadband deployment. And these staffers are so open to actually scheduling these meetings because they can get a 2-for-1, quite frankly. And from my perspective with Larry, my colleague, it's like half the effort to cover all these offices. So that's something we've tried to do that's like brand new to me.
Wow.
To kind of split off, but still get our voice heard and get access to these offices that usually you would take a week or 2 weeks before they'd even get back to you after several hits to try to remind them that you put the official request in.
Well, let me offer two things to that follow-up. First, Rob, I agree with you on the in-person thing. We've built our long-lasting relationships because we've gotten to know these people, and you do that by getting to know them in person and face-to-face type of meetings. It's going to be very difficult to build that strong relationship you have with offices, particularly when they turn over so often. It's going to be so hard to kind of begin to recultivate those relationships with new people when you're doing it over the phone or text or email. They don't know you. They don't really have a good sense of who you are.
Right.
I'll also say, to your point, JB, I've had more calls, not just with one staffer, but I've had them with committee where it's both sides of the aisle. So I'm killing two birds with one stone, and you got 4 or 5 staffers there asking the question. So you don't have to do these 4 or 5 individuals. They're bringing everybody in, and I do think it makes it kind of effective from that standpoint. The other question we have here is I'm going to have 2 here. One is from Amy, and her question is, how are you dealing with the virtual hearings, and how do you see those going forward in the past? Because they have been very valuable, I think, for people to go in person. I see the Senate is now allowing in-person witnesses, so we'll see how soon before the House does that. But how valuable do you see these virtual hearings versus what we are usually accustomed to, and will they continue to be virtual? JB, why don't you start?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hit. I mean, it's a hit to us. We'd rather have those open and open to the public and open to being there in person. It's an opportunity to foot traffic in the hallway leading up to the hearing. The actual policies, though, usually they still keep to the scheduling, so you at least are aware of the opportunity to put a statement into the record, or to work with staff on a QFR, question for the record, or a list of follow-up options. The good news, I mean, just like the regular versions of the hearings, they're all webcast, except for some of the classified or defense-related ones. But you at least get to take the value you can get out of that and provide it, interpret it and manipulate it to your client's perspective. So that's still available. They still publicly, like I said, make it well known so you can do the stuff behind the scenes. But really, nothing replaces, as Rob said, nothing really replaces that in-person direct eye-to-eye connection. It's been 3 months since I've shaken a hand or handed off a business card. Now, we can all do that with our digital signatures. It's just not the same.
Yeah, no kidding.
How about you, Rob, from the agency perspective, like the round tables and things like that? Will those now go away? Because I have found, I've seen you at a lot of those. Those are valuable experiences, not only from the one-on-ones with the agency, but the people that you run into and build those coalitions with. Now, will those go away and become virtual? Which, for me, I have no interest really in those.
I mean, boy, that's a really good question. I mean, I think next year, this is a big prediction, but my prediction is that we'll go back to more face-to-face meetings in the sense of larger groups, 20, 40, 50. That is absolutely critical. The government, I don't think politically, both on the Hill and at the agencies, can really embrace this lack of transparency. And the government historically has not been transparent. And so they will have a tendency to move toward, let's not have any meetings. But I don't think they can sustain that. There'll be some offices that will just be a problem. But I think the pressure for transparency will go, they'll go back to the hearings. And I think they'll go back to actual meetings, roundtables and so forth with government officials. I mean, that absolutely is imperative. I'll tell you, there will be a lot of pressure from industry to go back to the way we used to do things. And we didn't really touch upon this, Paul, but clients do not like all of this virtual meetings. No, clients like to go in, especially in the procurement world, to try to develop relationships with procurement officials at the agencies is absolutely key. It really is key. Because a lot of the folks I represent, the agencies don't know who they are. They've never heard of the company's name, especially small businesses. And the idea of seeing you and liking you and developing a relationship is absolutely critical for business relationships on any level, especially in federal procurement. And I think the Hill the same way. I think there's going to be pressure from constituents to want to see the staffers, you know, to want to go in. It's going to be pretty hard to say no. I think it'll be harder for the Hill to say no than it will be for some of the agency people. So go back to my earlier comments. I am concerned about some of the agencies, and they may look at this as a way to reduce contact and communication. But I think there'll be a lot of pressure from industry for face-to-face meetings.
Because Rob, I think you hit the nail on the head from the agency standpoint, and I think to a lesser degree on the Hill side of it, it will have an impact as well. When you're a small business or you're not a known commodity within an agency and you have that 1 hour opportunity to go do the dog and pony show and you're not able to do that and you have to do it through this process, there's just too many distractions. We've all sat through webinars and programs and where we were doing other things. And I think that you lose that opportunity, you lose a competitive edge that you may have going in, actually making your case face-to-face with a professional like yourself or others. So I'm hoping we go back to the way things were.
Yeah.
And here's a question from Megan. How are you thinking about the ground activities with legislators like plant tours, facility visits, etc.? Do you see those going away, or do you see members getting back out there and doing those, or are they doing them now? JB, why don't you start?
We've struggled with that kind of question, and we also take a look at the fly-in schedule, and so maybe I can thread the needle and connect it to Megan's question. For the folks that I represent, where we rely on a Capitol Hill, Capitol Day on the Hill fly-in opportunity. Once a year, our members come in and visit with their congressional delegation and staff. That's a big miss. We missed that. We had that scheduled for April the 1st of this year, and we had to cancel that. And then we were given some thought to doing some version of a grassroots version of a Day on the Hill. And what you get in the issue there is that with the pandemic, with every state operating differently, how do you script a nationwide outreach effort where each state is handling the pandemic differently? And so we always make the pitch about how politics is not a one-off, it's a relationship, and it's a political process. And so theoretically, when the members are back in their district or senators are back in their state, usually they're accessible, especially this time of year with parades. They're doing breakfasts to civic clubs. They're getting individual invitations. Now, with House members, some of them will have their district offices available or open, but even access to those is probably somewhat up in the air and questionable because, again, of the social distancing issues. So that's a great question, Megan. We're still struggling to figure out what the best way to move forward. Take a look at the political conventions this year. Look at the chaos and the uncertainty. For I think it's Milwaukee and Charlotte. And how are the parties actually going to do their version of a political convention? And then fast forward to the campaign platforms there. But then again, if you're going to micro-target a message into each state and district, you really have got to go one state at a time and try to figure things out. And that's where I think if you're representing a trade association or professional society, and you have a version of a state affiliate or state chapter, I think that's where you have an opportunity to leverage that opportunity. In some cases, state chapters and affiliates have their own version of a state lobbyist, right? That does the work in the state legislatures. So I think that's where you really maybe just micro target and try to do some messaging off of that. But it's really kind of turned everything upside down in that regard.
How about you, Rob? Anything on your end?
No, pretty much. I think JB got it.
Let me go. Those are some really good questions. So let me move on. The one question that I didn't touch on earlier that was in one of the chat boxes that'll tie to this one. With the work that you're doing in Congress, and I'm assuming agency personnel as well, everything is COVID, COVID, COVID. Are you, particularly the question came up, how are you dealing with the appropriations process? How are you doing with other, again, COVID-related things aren't the only thing on Congress's agenda or within an agency that they have to do this year. How do you get the attention of those folks when you have a priority for your industry that's not COVID related?
So let me jump in and try to go for this at first. So during the initial stages of the pandemic, I would say that if you were going to put a ratio out there for how much was pandemic related versus regular business, I would say our efforts were 90-10. I'd say that probably slowed down a bit, down to maybe 70% of the time is still on the pandemic and the COVID opportunities, 30% regular issues. So going back to an earlier answer I had about being proactive and reaching back out to congressional staff that you already have relationships with because you're already dealing with bills or issues or policies pre-COVID. But, you know, I think there's also an opportunity for staff. Staff is now probably getting the green light to start looking at other issues beyond the pandemic and beyond COVID. So I think there's an opening here that if say in my perspective, 70% of what I do is still COVID related and 30% isn't, then that I think would be a healthy expectation for the expectation on Capitol Hill staff that eventually they're also trying to get back to normal with other issues. And as the COVID response packages have somewhat slowed down compared to the initial stages of the pandemic, that provides us, I think, the window to work on other issues.
How about you from the agency side, Rob?
Yeah, I totally agree with JB. It really was the same on the Hill and the agencies. The agencies, the first April and May were really nothing but COVID. And so people in the agencies didn't want really to talk to anybody if they had something non-COVID related. And you did have to hook, and we did this, we hooked everything's COVID related to some extent, right? So we would try to hook a COVID issue on anything where we're trying to speak to an agency executive. Otherwise, we knew they weren't going to talk to us. I have noticed in the last couple of weeks that agencies do have other missions, and they are going to have to start focusing on routine, shall we say, routine procurements and routine mission-related activities. They're beginning now to be receptive to speaking about big procurements and so forth that they have to get in place before the end of the fiscal year. And so they're willing to talk about non-COVID related things at this point. So that's a huge development. And I think Congress really, quite frankly, will be the same, right? They're going to have to talk about other issues at some point besides just COVID-related legislation. Although I think the rest of this year is going to be tough. It's just going to be tough. You're not going to see a lot of progress on any legislative fronts.
Well, let me ask you both this question. Rob, I'll have you go first. With everything that's going on, and Rob, yours will be a little bit different being agency, and they'll still need some of it. But do you see clients being upset with the way the Zooms and all these phone calls are having to go through the process to get your issue out there, your contract looked at, being unhappy with that process? Will they need less of you and focus more on having somebody internally make those calls or make those pitches to the agencies? And JB, same on the Hill side. Will lobbyists, with more grassroots lobbying, will there be less of a need for those professionals in the lobbying side of it and rely more on constituents to do this type of work going forward?
Well, with respect to the Hill, what I've noticed in the last 10 years is there has been a decrease in expertise in acquisition. There are very few people, there are always very few people on the Hill who really had expertise in acquisition. It's been incredibly frustrating the last couple of years, quite frankly, to try to find staffers who really can communicate on these issues. And I do think there's an appreciation. There's an appreciation for expertise in subject areas. So with respect to federal acquisition, I am noticing that some of the staffers sort of like want to hear from somebody who's been in the business for a long time. They just don't know. They don't know what is a good acquisition reform initiative. They don't know. So I think that there's still going to be value with people with experience in subject areas on the Hill, where they can bring value and help educate some of the young staffers that are there. There's been such enormous turnover, as you know. In the agencies, it's somewhat based on relationships. You know, it's the agencies generally, again, don't like to really talk to people. And it really helps to have someone like us who have the longevity with working with them and have a relationship, an ongoing relationship with them. So bottom line to your question, yeah, I think there'll be a role for folks like us who have been around, who understand the process. And I'm, of course, involved in a very, subject matter specific subject matter area, federal acquisition. And I think it does help bring a little bit of gravitas to the table to have someone with decades of experience in a particular subject area. So I think that with respect to, I think there'll always be a need for that. And quite frankly, Paul, when there's situations where I don't know people and I have no relationship with them and it makes it incredibly hard, it helps to say, hey, I know something about this subject area. I'm somewhat an expert in this area. So they're somewhat more receptive to listen to you. But I think that it would be incredibly difficult for folks in industry, again, because I'm finding it true even in my situation, where you have no relationship with the person at all, to really try to break in the door. It's very difficult even for someone like me. But I think it makes it easier if you at least have some type of expertise in the subject matter that you're speaking about. And so I think that industry will always need folks like, for better or for worse, will need people like us to help in facilitating communication with both federal agencies and the Hill.
I like that term, facilitating. I like it. How about you, JP?
Did you think I was going to say anything else?
Hey, Paul, the threat and danger in your question, I think is a real one. It could be there, and it could grow if there's no counter voice to guide them as they start to reach that kind of conclusion. So in my view, we need to interject, remind our clients of the work we have underway, and then remind them of the value we provide to them. But also make sure when it comes to technology that we keep as cutting edge as possible so they actually don't try to look for something better in that regard. But I think it's part of what keeps all of us on our toes is client value, client satisfaction, keeping folks happy and accomplishing, getting results for them. I'll make an example or two. I guess in the last 2 weeks, I've done 2 specific targeted outreach that I typically don't do. One was to a state chapter in Pennsylvania. The other one was Illinois for something. And I got engagement out of them where I haven't in the past. And I provided value right back to them based on what that meant for activity on Capitol Hill. So, this is an interesting time that we obviously are trying to adapt to. But any which way that we can interject and remind them of the value, but also expose them, if they haven't already, to the value we provide them. I think that's where we really need to help pivot and make sure that they know exactly what they've signed us up to do in the first place.
Well, and I think that both what you said, it really makes a difference, because I do have somewhat of a concern. I'm all for everybody getting out there and doing the grassroots thing. I think that's important. I think we need to see more of that, and we have over the last few years, and that's been great to see. My concern is that it becomes a free-for-all, and that there is no coordination, and people are out there just doing their own thing, throwing things out there. And I think that will lead to members and staff closing themselves off to us, and that is a big concern for me, is that our government will close themselves off, because again, as great as grassroots support is, it also, if it's not coordinated, it's not messaged right, and it's not done in the call it right way, I think it's going to pose more chaos and more problems. And social media, quite frankly, and maybe I'm alone here, social media does not help in that regard. I think it's more of a problem than it is a help in what we're trying to accomplish here on the local, state, or federal level. So we are out of time, gentlemen. I have not even touched on most of the questions that I had. Maybe at some point in time we could do a follow-up. Let me just double check, make sure we don't have any other questions from people here. No, we don't. I want to thank you both. I thought this was very helpful for me. I've picked up a few things here. You gentlemen have been doing this a long time, and I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom with everybody else. With that, I will let everybody know. Thank you. This has been recorded. It will be sent out to people if they want it. But please, we have some other events coming up. You can check out our website at just Lobbyist Institute or lobbyist.com, lobbyistinstitute.com. And we will happy to have you. But if you have any questions, please get a hold of us. We would love to hear from you about this webinar and others that you may want to see. So thank you very much to JB. Rob, thank you. And I hope to see you for beers or something. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Rob.
Thanks. Good seeing you guys.
Thank you.